On this edition of Independent Sources, Black and Not Proud, more Latinos deny their African roots and identify as white. And cutting to cope. A growing number of Hispanic teens are using frightening methods as a means of coping with assimilation. Those stories and more coming up. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. A recent study from the Pew Research Center revealed that while nearly a quarter of U.S.-based Latinos identify as Afro Latino, only 18% identify as Black. Furthermore, the report states that many Afro Latinos identify as simply being white or white in combination with another race. It's a perennial issue in that community that often associates beauty standards and socioeconomic status with the varying shades of skin tone. I spoke with Dr. Dinzey-Flores from the Afro Latino Forum. She is the principal investigator at the organization Latinos and Racial Identity Project. We talk about the history behind this trend and the impact among Hispanics. Dr. Dinzey-Flores, tell us why the majority of Afro Latinos are not accepting the fact that they're Black.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we're not really sure if that is the case. I know that there's the Pew report has come out, and really it's very confusing for us because it goes against some of what we thought was true of Afro Latinos. For example, we thought that Afro Latinos tended to be native born. We thought that Afro Latinos tend to be more educated than those that do not identify themselves as Afro Latinos. But the report suggests the contrary, that Afro Latinos tend to be foreign born, that Afro Latinos are less educated. And then we have this surprising question about Afro-Latinos that have said they are Afro-Latinos, then don't say that they're Black, and they end up saying that they're white. So we really don't understand how this question was asked, what was the structure, how does somebody that first say they're Afro-Latino, that has already declared in some essence their Blackness, then reverts and says they're white. So the report has caused more confusion for us, and we really have to understand how those questions were asked, and how the numbers were massaged to come to this report.
Fair enough, but generally, Afro-Latinos, do they accept the Afro part of the Latino, or are they just Latino? What's the general feeling among Afro-Latinos in this country?
Well, I mean, it goes to say that if somebody says they're Afro-Latinos, they have already, by definition, affirmed their Blackness, right? Afro, that part of the equation suggests that people are already inclined to say that they're of African descent. Now, a different question would be, what are Latinos, right? Which span the whole gamma of color and may have indigenous roots, or or European roots, or are of African descent, whether they are readily accept their that they're of African descent. And that we have a lot more information. We know that we have very small numbers of Latinos saying that they are Black and Afro-Latino. And so there is a tendency, and this is the same shared history and ideologies of white supremacy that are pervasive even in the U.S., this idea that whiteness is better, and so there's a proclivity for Latino populations to identify themselves as white rather than recognize, right, their heritage of oppression, of slavery that we share with all of the Americas.
Is being Afro-Latino viewed as a negative thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the truth is that race and race affects us all, right? And we live in societies that are formed by racial hierarchies, where opportunity is defined by not the color of your skin, and so, there is this underlying desire to for not all, but for a good portion of our population to approximate whiteness because it relieves people from the oppressions and discrimination that are targeted at Black people throughout the Americas. So that is true, but there's also an affirmation and a growing recognition that it is important not only to recognize your cultural connection to Africa, but also to recognize that there is inequality and racism, and that the only way to address inequality and racism is to affirm that some of us are treated differently than others, and that is largely based on our skin color.
Well, could it also be that the color definition in Latin American and some Caribbean countries are not cut and dry? It's not black and white. You have different type of Afro, if you will, and so the choice of blackness is complicated in Latin America.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of the what we know up to now, and what scholars have been working with in the past that is now largely contested is this idea that it's more complex in the Americas and that it's harder to pin down. And some scholars have been negating that position and suggesting, you know what, it's complex everywhere, right? There's range. There are people that are lighter skinned in the U.S. There are people that are darker skinned in the U.S. as well. And the thought is that in the U.S., the idea of race is a binary. You're either Black or you're not. If you have a little bit of Black blood, you're Black, and if not, then you're white. But in the Americas, it might happen. There might be a greater gradient, but we still see among Latinos that we typically act as if we know who is Black and who we know who has privilege due to their skin color. So even if those interpretations are that there is a wider spectrum of color, we still see the same patterns where those that are lighter skin are more privileged, and those that are darker skin tend to be low-income communities. Sure. and have less opportunity, and also get the effects of discrimination and racism. So those patterns still apply to Latinos, and so it's more similar.
So what's likely to happen as the number of Latinos that are predicted to continue to rise to the next 5, 20, even 30 years? So are we likely to see this issue resolve or get even more complicated?
Yeah, I mean, some studies have suggested, some people talk about the Latin Americanization of race relations in the U.S. and that, now we're going to have a freer, more democratic type of racial alignment. But in fact, I think that the conversation should head in a different direction, which is how do we recirculate and keep doing some of the same we have some of the same patterns of discrimination and lack of access to opportunities that get recycled when people are of darker descent. If you look at some of the Latino populations that are of African descent, their outcomes, their socioeconomic outcomes are very similar to African Americans, right? They're living under very similar conditions when compared to lighter-skinned Latinos. So in fact...
Is the case unified across Latin America, or are there places where it's worse than others?
Yeah, there's some suggestion that these societies, they're very similar. They share similar histories, but they're also a wide range of differences, right, of variances. So some societies, for example, like some nations like Brazil receive, a very high proportion of African slaves and in other societies as well receive African people that were then enslaved when compared to some of, for example, the Southern Cone, maybe less. But across all of these societies, you have the presence of Black people. And there's actually a myth that in some of these societies it's indigenous. They're only indigenous and Spanish, and that's absolutely not true.
But for me, it's interesting because, I mean, I'm very aware of Blackness, but in many countries in Latin America, I didn't know they had sizable Black population until I saw their soccer team. For instance, when I see Colombia, when I see Peru, and Chile, and I'm like, oh, you have Black people there. I didn't know that. Why is the Black population in these countries so obscure to none of us who don't live there?
Yeah, and that's a process of invisibilizing the Black populations in these societies. There is this myth that, everyone is mixed but there is an African presence that's often not recognized, not counted. We see the case of Mexico, where suddenly they introduce a race question, and they have over 1 million Mexicans that are Black.
Oh, yeah.
And so often it's been a process of not counting, of not acknowledging, right? And not counting because there's thoughts of it, disrupting the social order, of highlighting antagonisms, of breaking with national unity. So there's some of these ideas that come into play, but the truth is that they exist and they're there. And the process of counting them is important in order to address often what are marginal populations and populations that are facing tough conditions precisely because of being of African descent.
So, Dr. Dinzey-Flores, is the situation exacerbated in the U.S. when they come here?
Yeah, I mean, the thought is that suddenly people of African descent, like me, like we come here and we suddenly recognize that we're Black, and that's a myth that also needs to be dispelled. It's true that here the U.S. has a longer, and we can talk about the reasons for that, but that has a longer history of making explicit or a conscious discussion around race. It's ironic that I'm saying that because the thought is that now people don't want to talk about race in the U.S., but relative to these societies, there is a sense that here people can talk about it. I think that there is a tendency then for some people to now face the realities that they are entering a society where they're unequivocally Black and that they're going to be read and understood as Black. And it expands the number of people that fit within that category in the U.S. And so it may, in some ways, it might be a positive thing in that now there's a source of understanding why some of these inequalities were in place to begin with in the societies. It may arm people to go back to their, countries and say, you know what, I see these same patterns going here, and I was able to explicitly see it and say it, and now I can say it here. But it also leads to some, and we've seen a lot more of this, of some kind of trying to push what being Black is in this setting in the U.S.
Dr. Dinzey-Flores, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
When we come back, a disturbing trend that's emerging amongst young Hispanic teens trying to fit in. Before that, Zafis LeBrun has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. The Amsterdam News reports that according to a new report by the New York City Food Bank, African Americans experience both poverty and food insecurity at levels significantly higher than average. More than 140,000 New Yorkers will face renewed pressure this April when their benefits from SNAP will be withdrawn. Statistics show that nearly 1 in 5 New Yorkers benefit from the assistance. Advocates hope that by bringing awareness to the benefits of programs like SNAP, lawmakers can either reevaluate the state budget or come up with other alternatives to feed families in need. From DNA Info, the NYPD will no longer automatically arrest people for low-level violations. The current policy states that a person with an outstanding felony warrant caught committing a minor offense in Manhattan, such as drinking in public, would be arrested for the felony and the low-level violation. This would require the judge to spend time hearing and ruling on both cases. However, under the new program, a person with an outstanding warrant caught committing a minor offense will only face arrest for the felony. The low-level charge will be dealt with as a summons by a judge on the spot. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. expects the change to eliminate up to 10,000 arrests per year and help clear Manhattan court's summons backlog. In other news, the Uptown Collective via DNA Info profiles a new vegan soul food restaurant that gives Harlem diners healthier options. African Americans suffer from higher rates of blood pressure, cancer, and heart disease than any other race. This is largely in part due to their diets. Restaurant owner Brenda Beener decided to open up her restaurant when her husband gave up meat. Using tricks from her father, who worked as a chef in New Orleans, Beener opened up a small setup that consisted of 3 warming plates at Lily's Bakery on 118th Street. She eventually opened her own business called Seasoned Vegan at St. Nicholas Avenue and 113th Street. Beener runs the restaurant with her son, Aaron, who says, quote, "People have been screaming for healthier food options in this neighborhood for a very long time." In related news, City Limits takes a look at why the boom in New York City's restaurant industry is not trickling down to chefs of color. The City Department of Health revealed that permits for restaurants, bars, and cafes rose more than 27% at the start of 2015. The rise in the restaurant industry is accompanied by a need for qualified chefs, but this demand is not making its way to chefs from lower-income neighborhoods. Back in 2006, the New York Times ran an article about the struggle that black chefs face. Marcus Samuelson, a TV personality and chef owner of Red Rooster, a Harlem establishment, says hiring at Red Rooster is driven by a commitment to enabling people to live and work in their communities. Now a staple of the Harlem cuisine scene, the restaurant boasts 150 local employees. Samuelson recently became co-chairman of the Careers Through Culinary Arts program, or CCAP, an organization that provides career opportunities in the food service industry for underserved youth. And finally, a new exhibit at a Brooklyn Heights church hopes to counter unfavorable perceptions about asylum seekers by showing that they are just ordinary people. The exhibit is called Facing America. The Brooklyn paper reports that St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church commissioned Japanese photographer Hidemi Takagi to shoot 19 refugees currently living in Connecticut. Each subject is receiving assistance from Integrated Refugee and Immigration Services, a program run through the church's Episcopal Migration Ministries to help them find housing and jobs. Takagi's subjects come from Syria, Sudan, Congo, Eritrea, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Facing America, portraits of refugees resettling in the U.S. will be on display at the St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church from now until March 25th. Those were just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. One mental health professional is sounding an alarm because of what she says is a growing number of Hispanic teens who are resorting to self-harm or cutting as a means of dealing with anxiety and stress. Elizabeth Figueroa is the clinic supervisor at Upper Manhattan Mental Health. She says that Latinas in particular are turning to this method as a means of assimilating. This is at a time when a report from the Association of School and College Leaders and the National Children's Bureau showed that 8 out of 10 schools reported an increased number of students were cutting as a means of coping with cyberbullying and stress. Zafir Slobour spoke to Figueroa about why this problem is new for many Hispanic parents in poorer communities and the impact it's having on their families.
Elizabeth, thank you so very much for being in studio with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about self-harm. All right. So to introduce the audience to the whole term self-harm, what exactly is self-harm?
Well, self-harm, as I view it, is a phenomena that has been a part of history since ancient Greece. I can think of 2 incidents that were deemed self-harm in the turn of the 19th century. There were girls that were called hysterics that were using needles and putting them under their skin. And we all know about the story about Vincent van Gogh and the cutting of his ear. As we see self-harm right now, it is cutting, scratching, putting needles into your skin, with knives, razors, safety pins, and needles that kids now are subscribing to.
Now, why do children resort to self-harm?
There's twofold. One is there's Judith Herman, who back in 1992 studied self-harm and the people that were self-harming. And those were people that had been victims of physical sexual abuse, that had been victims of domestic violence, that had been victims of incest.
Wow.
These are the traumas that we're seeing in the clinic. Twofold to that is that these young people are moving between two worlds. They're immigrants, recent immigrants that come to this country and having a very difficult time assimilating and adapting. And there are stressors to that. And that is very painful.
Right, right. So is the use of self-harm a means of, one, dealing with the trauma you just mentioned, and two, assimilating?
It's a way of dealing with emotions that you cannot cope with. It's a maladaptive way of dealing with emotions that you can't cope with.
And that is the underlying factor there in both
Yes.
of those situations.
Right.
Okay, so when we spoke before off camera, we talked about the fact that social media was playing a role in this process of, you know, affecting Latino and immigrant populations as well. And if we can bring up the video, just a really quick video
Sure.
of some of what's available online. This here it's very graphic, just for the audience to know, it's very graphic. And so what kind of role does video such as this play in you know, influencing, you know, young immigrants?
Well, if a child does not know how to cope with their emotions, if they're stressed and they are being told that this is a way that children in American society cope with their pain and with their suffering, it's promoting maladaptive behaviors. And it's important to understand that young people, young Latino immigrants, are trying to adapt, to assimilate, to fit in. And they're going by what resources they are receiving. And if their peers are doing this, it's a promotion, you know, a documentary for, and an okay, almost, to say, this is the way that I cope, this is the way you should cope.
Right, right. And I just wanted to pick up on that point you talked about there about coping. The gentleman who posted this video of self-harm, there was this description, it's available on YouTube, and there's a description where he talks about the fact that self-harm does not equal suicide. And he says, let's not generalize. Let us be open-minded and not stereotype self-harm as a process to killing oneself. If you want to know more about self-harm, please do your responsibility of research on the internet before posting your comments. Now, I just read verbatim what he posted, but part of that is, like you said, is a bit of a promotion of it. I mean, how much more of stuff like this is available online as regards to, hey, listen, you know, self-harm is a good thing?
I would say that most of what people are posting is rejecting this as a coping mechanism. But what's really concerning is that there's enough information out there that says this is the way for me to cope. This, I certainly say that, you know, I don't judge. And I would say to anyone that sees this, he's right, don't judge me.
Right.
We have a term that we call non-suicidal self-harm. But the reality is this, that people can take it to another level, and that is concerning for us. And most definitely that this is not a way to cope with your emotions, to self-regulate, that there are other ways for you to be able to cope with your emotions and to self-regulate. And we'd like to be able to help young people to do that. They're at a developmental stage where they are impressionable, and we need to be able to support them through this, not judge them, but be there to be able to help them find other ways to cope.
Now, how are parents now coping with this? Because we're talking about a community of people probably have not had to deal with this specific sort of coping on the part of their children. How are parents dealing with this?
Yeah, when they come to the clinic, one thing that I do is I celebrate the fact that they come to the clinic because they don't understand therapy and they don't believe in it, but they're there and they've brought their kids. And I think that that's amazing. But there's a lot of psychoeducation that has to come with sitting with a parent and saying, this is, you know, it is concerning. I know that you're scared, but let's take things one step at a time. We are going to look at the behavior, we're going to understand the family dynamics and what the contribution of what is going on in the family, and let's talk about the problem, and let's unpack the problem so that we can then get to the issue at hand. Why is this kid cutting?
Now you have talked about the fact that you're seeing these numbers increasing in the community that you serve. Now, is it your opinion that you might just be seeing the tip of the iceberg because of the very reason that some parents don't want to come in, or some children don't want to come in because they don't believe in seeking out therapy or assistance?
The papers that I've researched, many of the papers will indicate that we do not know the number of kids that are really self-harming, self-mutilating, because they don't see it as seriously as perhaps I do or other mental health professionals and see it. So we're not seeing the real numbers. They're not coming to the emergency room. They're not coming to the hospitals. So yes, I think it's, you know, it is the tip of the iceberg. What's for us in the immigrant community, we think, well, you know, there are other issues at hand that we're dealing with. What's going on? So there's a social contagion factor to this for kids that feel that they're outside of the norm.
Right, right.
And that is what's bringing this about. The kids are copying each other's behavior.
Right, because there's some notion that perhaps before cutting was something of a more affluent, there's something associated with a more affluent society, more affluent white society, if you will. Just,
yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody who's watching this and is interested in perhaps coming in, if they're concerned about their child, can they reach out to you and your organization?
Absolutely. The Upper Manhattan Mental Health Clinic is made up of, I'd say that one of the first things for an immigrant community is to find a place that's diverse, multicultural, that can speak your language, and that understands this issue from the vantage point of being in the community and seeing these cases. Upper Manhattan Mental Health is on 145th Street, 646-340-1407, and it's the child and adolescent clinic of the mental health facility at Upper Manhattan.
All right. Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much for coming in, even though this is a bit of a morbid but a serious topic to deal with.
Yeah, it's frightening, and that turns people away, but what we need to do is face it head on and not be afraid, because it's something that is workable with good therapy.
All right, thank you.
And psychiatric meds sometimes.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming in, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.